There is one power tool that is very commonly used in woodworking, but it is also the power tool that is extremely intimidating, especially to someone who is just starting out. And that is a table saw. And it is intimidating for good reason. I mean, there is an exposed huge blade right here which spins really fast, and if you are not careful, it can cause what is called kickback and throw these pieces of wood flying back at you, causing severe injury. But like any other power tool, if you understand how it operates, if you understand the functions, and if you understand what can go wrong and what not to do, you can safely use a table saw and confidently start building projects. It's going to open up a whole world of possibilities for your woodworking. So we are going to dive into everything that you need to know to get started with a table saw and start making some simple basic cuts safely. And if you are new here, I am Annika and I'm here to demystify DIY and inspire and empower you to build all the projects. And if you are just getting started, be sure to grab a Power Tools Simplified Guide with the link in the description below. Now, let's talk table saws. So what exactly can a table saw do? Well, a table saw can pretty much make the cuts, the same kind of cuts that you can make with other saws as well. But the main difference between a table saw and the other saws like a miter saw or a circular saw is the fact that in those saws, the wood is stationary and you are actually pushing the blade through the wood. But in case of the table saw, the blade is stationary and you are pushing the wood through the blade. So once you get all of your settings dialed in, you can make extremely accurate repeated cuts very easily. Some of the cuts that you can make with a table saw are a rip cut, where you're basically reducing the width of the board by cutting the board mostly in the direction of the grain. You can also make what are called cross cuts, which you are basically reducing the length of a board and cutting perpendicular to the grain. Plus, because the blade tilts, you can also make beveled cuts and you can make mitered cuts. Also, you can make dado cuts with the table saw. You can use a different blade for it, or you can use a regular blade to make those cuts. The only type of cut you cannot make with a table saw are curved cuts, and you need a jigsaw for that. There are a few different types of table saws that you'll come across. This one here is what is called a job site saw. It's a small saw, it's a compact saw. It is pretty lightweight. It's basically meant to be picked up and taken to the job site. It does make a great starter saw. The other type of saw is a cabinet saw, which isn't meant for making cabinets. I mean, you can make cabinets on that, but it's not because it's meant for making cabinets. It's because it has a huge motor, it has a cabinet underneath, and it's heavy and large and it's hard to move it around. But you can also make much larger cuts on it. So before we start learning how to use it, you do want to get acquainted with all of the parts of the table saw so you know exactly what each part does and how to set it up. So first up, of course, we have the table. This is what is going to be supporting the workpiece and keeping it stable as you are cutting it. And since I have a job site saw, it's pretty compact, but it does have this lever in here that I can open to extend this wing out to be able to support larger boards. My job site saw basically goes up all the way to 26 inches. And then of course we have the blade right here in the middle, and there's an arbor in here that holds the blade in that we can use to tighten and loosen to change the blade out. And this right here is what is called a throat plate, and this is basically meant to cover up this large gap and keep pieces of wood from falling in between, and also for supporting the boards as you are making the cuts. Now I do have a ruler up here in the front of the table saw, which is something that I can use to set up the measurements on my saw as I'm making the cuts. And in the front here, of course, I have the power button. It does have safety attachment too, so if I have this out, it doesn't turn on. I do need to put it back in to be able to turn on my table saw. So I never keep my table saw connected to the power because it's on a mobile stand and I just move it around. But if you always keep your table saw connected to the power, you want to probably remove the safety and keep it off so that nobody accidentally turns it on. Right here is the height adjustment and the angle adjustment. So this lever right here basically changes the height of the blade, and then I can change the tilt of the blade by turning this. We have something that is called a rip fence, and this basically sits here and gets clamped to the scale. It does have an indicator in here, and you can basically adjust the width of the cut that you want to make. So essentially you use this anytime you are making a rip cut. And for cross cuts, you have what is called a miter gauge, and this is the one that came with the saw. You can also make your own miter gauge, or you can buy one which is larger and supports larger material. But the way this works is there are miter slots in the table saw table, and you can simply insert it and use that to make your cross cuts. And we'll talk more about exactly how to make those cuts in just a little bit. And lastly, you have a dust collection port right here, which connects to either a shop vac or a dust collection system. I have an adapter on here to connect to my dust collection system, and it basically helps you manage all the sawdust. A discussion about a table saw cannot happen without a discussion on safety. And like any other power tool, I highly recommend you take a look at the manual that came with the tool to get yourself familiar with it. But like anytime you're using a power tool, you do not want any loose hair, loose jewelry, long sleeves, loose clothing, etc. And you always want to use hearing protection, eye protection, and area protection. Now with a table saw specifically, you want to use some safety devices that help make using the saw safe. And those include, of course, a push stick that probably came with your miter saw. You can also buy push sticks that look like this. I prefer this over these push sticks because I feel like I have a better control on what is going on. You can also use push blocks like these, and these ones really help you make sure that you keep your fingers away from the blade. And then there's also feather boards that also help make sure that your board stays where it needs to be, goes where it needs to go, and there's no kickback. And we'll talk about everything that you need to know on how to use these in just a little bit. Now apart from that, you want to make sure that your table saw is sitting on a nice sturdy spot. If you have a stand, you want to make sure that it's nice and stable. If it's not, please use some shims and make sure that it's nice and even, because the workshop surfaces can usually be non-uniform and it can cause a lot of wobbles, and you definitely don't want that during operation. Next, you want to make sure that you have space all around you, enough space for the size of the boards that you are going to be cutting. As you are making the cuts, you don't want the boards to be bumping into things and distracting you from the cut that you're making. Remember, as you're using the saw, you want to have your full focus on the saw. Next, you want to make sure you have something to hold and support the board as it exits the cut, and that is called an outfeed table. You can have an outfeed table, you can have roller stands. Basically, you want to have something that is going to support the board as it exits the cut. Because if you don't support that end and it starts to fall down, it's going to go like that, and that's not going to be good or safe. So I built this table saw stand. It's got a folding outfeed table, so when I'm not using it, it basically is this little footprint, and I can fold it and put it away. You can also use roller stands like I mentioned, or you can build this to be at the same height as your workbench, so you can use your workbench as an outfeed table whenever you need to. Now let's talk about kickback. Kickback is one of the most common and dangerous hazards of using a table saw, and it is the most common reason for injuries with a table saw. And the reason it happens is because this blade right here is spinning at a fast speed. It's spinning towards you. And as you are putting a board through the blade, if it is not supported properly or aligned properly, it is going to twist and bind the blade. And when it binds the blade or pinches the blade, it gets stuck, and the blade, since it's spinning, is going to throw it at a really high speed towards you. And I've heard reports of it being like 100 miles per hour. So imagine something like that flying towards you. It is going to injure you. So you definitely want to prevent that. Now, the number one way you can prevent kickback is by using a riving knife. The riving knife is basically set to the height of the blade or just a hair below it. And this basically is the key in preventing kickback. Kickback happens because when you are putting a board through, and as it gets to the end of the cut, as it exits the blade, it can start to come together and start to pinch. So the riving knife basically keeps the two cuts parallel to each other and keeps them from pinching the blade until they exit, so that they don't get caught on the blade and bind the blade and get thrown back at you. Once you remove the throat plate, there is a lever underneath here that you can use to adjust the height of the riving knife. And then we have these anti-kickback prongs. And what these are basically very similar to those spikes you have in the road where it's a one-way. So if you went the wrong way, these would slash your tires. So these do the exact same thing. They attach to the riving knife back here. And anytime you are passing your board through, they kind of grab onto it. So if there is kickback, they will stop the board from coming backwards. And then we have our blade guard that goes right here and attaches to the riving knife once again. And it essentially covers the blade and prevents you from accidentally touching the blade. Now, that said, you will notice in my videos, I don't usually have a blade guard or an anti-kickback prong. And the main reason for that is I don't like having a blade guard because it really hinders my vision of what is happening. I feel like I am not in control of what's going on because I can't really see everything, or I can't see the cut being made. So I don't like using the blade guard. Now, without the blade guard, if I need to use the anti-kickback prongs, I need to have the blade high, this high, and I am not comfortable having the blade this high. I always want to have the blade only about a tiny bit over the height of the board that I am cutting. So if I have to cut a 3/4 inch board, this is pretty much how high I need the blade to be. And that does not work. So I prefer not having the anti-kickback prongs, but most certainly the riving knife is non-negotiable. However, that said, if you're just starting out, please use the anti-kickback prongs and the blade guard. Be safe, do it the best way that you can. And if you are doing things like making a dado or just making a groove, you really can't do that with anti-kickback prongs in place. Now, apart from that, you want to make sure that you keep your blade sharp and clean, because that's going to make sure that your cut gets done really smoothly. Make sure you do not go through any big knots or nails in your material, because that can definitely create kickback. And anytime you are using a fence, you want to make sure that your fence is properly aligned to the blade so it doesn't push the material towards the blade and create that binding effect. You do not want to freehand cut anything, because you can end up twisting the board even so slightly, and the blade is spinning at a very high speed and it's going to create that kickback. Now, anytime you are making cross cuts, you want to use your cross cut or a miter gauge and not your fence. In fact, remove the fence, because the small pieces of cuts that you make next to the fence can get stuck over there and get thrown back at you. Lastly, but most importantly, anytime you're making a cut, you do not want to stand right here. You want to stand to the side and make sure that you are out of the way if anything gets thrown back. And one last thing before we get started making any cuts, you always want to approach your cuts carefully and responsibly and think every cut through. You do not want to rush any cuts. You want to take your time to set up, to think through every cut that you are going to make, where your hands are going to be, where are you going to stand, are you putting the right amount of force and pressure in the right spots for that board to be able to make it through the cuts. And that is it. Make sure you are aware of your surroundings and never do this when you are tired. Now let's go ahead and talk about setting up the table saw to make all of those cuts. Now, to start setting up your cut, the first thing we're going to do is check if everything is stable. The table saw is stable, the stand is stable, you have an out feet support, and then we are going to start with checking the alignment. First, I'm going to use a framing square and check the alignment of the blade to the table. So you shouldn't see any gaps between the framing square and the blade as you place it on the table. Next, you want to make sure that the riving knife is completely aligned with the blade. So we're going to place the framing square right here and make sure that this is really well aligned and there are no gaps. And we do the same thing on this side as well, because it is possible that if your blade is bent, it will not be aligned on one direction. Next, we're going to make sure that the fence is perfectly parallel to the blade. And to do that, I'm going to move the fence closer. I'm going to set this at 3 inches, and I'm going to use a marker and mark near one of the teeth. And then I'm going to use a measuring tape and measure the distance of the sawtooth from the fence, which is 3 inches, because we set it at 3 inches. And now I'm going to move this blade backwards so that my mark is back here, and I'm going to measure the distance one more time, and that should be 3 inches as well. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and make a rip cut. So first up, we're going to be cutting this piece of plywood down to 3 inches. So I have my fence set up at 3 inches. If your scale is not calibrated, you can make the adjustments. You can adjust the scale or the rip fence. Even though my scale is calibrated and my fence is set up, I still like to double check the measurement that I am cutting. So I always want to check from the fence to the inside of this blade, because we're taking curve into account, and make sure that that is the right distance. Next up, we are going to make sure we set the height of the blade to just above the surface of the workpiece. I like it to be just about a tooth above. Now we're ready to start making the cut, but before you turn on the table saw, you want to make sure that you kind of simulate the cut and gather all the safety devices that you need. So one thing that you need is most certainly a push block and a push stick. Essentially, anytime you are making the cut, you want to make sure that there are 2 directions of forces. Number one, downwards, so it's keeping the board down in contact with the table at all times. It doesn't lift up or down. And number 2, you're pushing the board toward the fence. So you want to make sure that the board is always in contact with the fence. It does not go away from the fence, because if it does, number 1, you're not going to get a straight cut. And most importantly, secondly, you are actually going to create situations where you can get kickback. To do this, obviously, a push block is extremely useful. It creates that downward pressure and it sort of holds the board to the fence, as well as you can use a push stick to kind of create that force that is basically keeping it towards the fence. Alternatively, you can also use a feather board. The way a feather board works is that it goes into the miter slot right here, and then you can adjust these knobs to adjust this distance right here. So if my board is going to be going right here, I can set it up to be at this distance and tighten it. And this then acts as that force that's basically keeping my board aligned as I am going through. So then I don't have to worry about creating that force towards the fence. Before operating the table saw, of course, you want to put on all of the safety gear. Now I'm going to turn on the table saw and let the blade come to a full speed. I'm using the push block to hold the plywood to the fence, making sure everything is aligned and slowly feeding the plywood through the blade. And as the end of the cut gets closer to the blade, you can switch to using a push stick to push the rest of the board through. To make the cut without a feather board, you can use your fingers or your hand to guide the cut and use a push block aligned to the fence as you're making the cut. Or you can also use push sticks, and this is how you use the different types of push sticks, although I highly recommend a push block. For extremely narrow rip cuts, I highly recommend using the push block because it gives you full control of the board and keeps your fingers completely away from the blade. We are going to go ahead and make some cross cuts, and to make the cross cuts, you want to use a miter gauge. This almost always comes with your table saw, and if you don't have one, you lost it, you can make your own, or you can also buy it separately. So this miter gauge basically slides right into the miter slots on the table saw. Now, the next thing we are going to do is we are going to get rid of the fence. The reason we're going to get rid of the fence is if we are making a cross cut, this cutoff piece can get twisted and stuck between the fence and the blade and can get thrown backwards at you. So you definitely do not want the fence. So let's take that out. Now, you always want to support your board. You want to support the workpiece, the part that you want to keep. So the miter gauge is the one that's going to be supporting your board as you are making the cut. It's going to make sure that it stays stable and supported as you make the cut, and everything is safe. Now, before you start using your miter gauge, you do definitely want to make sure that this is perpendicular to the miter slot. That is, if you are making 90-degree cuts. Now I'm going to go ahead and mark the exact location that I want to cut this board. So I want to cut it at 10 inches. Now I'm going to go ahead and align the mark that I made with the saw blade, and you want to make sure that you are accounting for the curve. So you want to make sure that the 10 inches that I measured are on this side of the blade towards the miter gauge side, and the waist side is on the other side of the blade. And we are going to make sure that the line is on this side of the blade because this is the part that we are keeping. So we are going to make sure that this edge of the blade lines up with the line. I am going to hold it tight to the miter gauge, bring it all the way back, turn on my table saw, and slowly make the cut, making sure I keep my hands away from the blade and keeping my miter gauge and the board extremely stable with my hands. To make a miter cut at a given angle, you can simply turn the miter gauge to that angle. Of course, you want to make sure that it's calibrated, and then make the cross cut exactly the way you did before. All right, now let's talk about bevel cuts. Now with a bevel cut, basically you want to tilt the blade, so you're making an angle between the table and the blade. And to do that, you can use the bevel adjustment in your table saw. Now, even though I set it up at 30 degrees, I am not very confident of the calibration of my table saw bevel adjustment. And I highly recommend that even if you have calibrated it, you always want to make a sanity check before you make the actual cuts, because especially when you start working with angles, you want to really make sure that they're dialed in, or you won't get those nice tight fits. So Since I set this up at 30 degrees, I want to make sure that this blade is at 30 degrees. And to do that, I like to use my digital angle finder. And the way we use this is, I'm going to set it up on the table, turn it on, and then I am going to zero it. It's already 0, which is great, but if it was not, I would hit the 0 button. Now that it's zeroed, I can take it and place it on my blade. And as you can see, it is not at 30 degrees. Well, it's not at 60 degrees. This is the 30-degree angle here. So this angle should be 60 degrees, which it is not. It's 0.6 degrees off. So now I can adjust my bevel until it becomes equal to exactly 60 degrees. There you go. So now that it is set up to 60 degrees, I can lock in my bevel measurement, and now I can make the cuts. Now, if you are making beveled cross cuts, you want to continue using your miter gauge and make those bevel cuts. If you are doing a bevel rip cut, you use your fence and run the boards through the rip cut. And that is it. Using a table saw does not need to be intimidating as long as you understand exactly how things work. The key really is to make sure that you have control of the board at all times as you are making those cuts. So if you are making the rip cut, you always want to make sure you're using the fence and you are applying the correct direction of forces. You want to make sure you apply a force towards the fence and force downwards to keep the board down. And if you are making cross cuts, you never want to use the rip fence. You want to use a miter gauge and hold the board steady as you make those cuts. And very importantly, you always want to use some safety devices to make sure that the cuts remain safe. And these ones are one of my favorites. These are the microjig grippers, not sponsored, but I absolutely love using these because these make me feel really confident, making sure that my fingers are always away from the blade. This one is their newest version, which is ready to go out of the box and is really quick and easy to start using. In addition to that, you also can get a push stick. Push sticks, this one is the kind that normally comes with a table saw. And to be honest, I'm not a big fan of these. I find them really flimsy, but I really like a push stick that looks like this. This gives me a good grip and good control of the board as it's going through and makes sure that my hands stay away from the blade. And that is it, my friends. If you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comments below. Let me know what other tool you would like me to talk about next. And if you are just getting started, be sure to grab that Power Tools Simplified Guide from the description below. I will see you next time.